Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here for our second of 3 feasibility meetings for the potential rebuild of Highland High School. We're glad to have you here again today. Again, these meetings are just simply, we're still in the feasibility stage. We're looking at some possible potential ways that we could put Highland, a new Highland High School together. And at this time, I'm going to turn the time over to our architect firm and let them kind of go through some of the plans. Thanks.
Thanks, and again, we're excited to be here. We really want to start by really thanking the groups that we've been working with right now, the steering committee that we've been a part of, the community group that's taken the surveys to really help us gather the information, as well as the teacher groups and the student groups. So really, all that information has really led us to where we are today. So we want to say thank you to those groups. So just as a reminder, what we're at today is, as Jeremy alluded to, we're still just in this early feasibility stage. We're about halfway through this whole entire process. And this is the graphic we looked at before. Here we are at this community meeting tonight. What we've been doing up till now is we had that first community meeting. We've done the community survey. And we continue to watch that as those get updated. We've been working with teachers and students in looking at their survey information. And we'll talk a little more about that tonight, as well as having some Highland High School teacher workshops that were right in this very space. And looking forward, tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the concepts that we've started. They're just early. They're just in the stages of kind of transitioning from the information we've been gathering. With that information, we've been building what these space needs are and some adjacency diagrams, some program documentation that we'll show tonight. And we are starting to develop these concepts. We'll then define a little bit more what these estimates of the construction are for the feasibility task, and ultimately recommend to the Board of Education the first part of February. So just a quick overview of kind of where we are and where we've been. So again, what we looked at last time, just the tradition of Highland High School, and it's really interesting what we kind of picked up on early on as we walked, we saw kind of echoed in those surveys, and so that was really helpful for us to understand the perspective of all the parties that we looked at. Again, so the first piece we're going to look at tonight is a kind of a review of these surveys. We started with the community, we'll look at the teacher, and we'll get into the student.
Yeah, so we got a ton of great data and information from all these surveys that we put out. And starting with the community survey, we got the first question was, what defines Highland tradition? And 25% of all the respondents used the word community in the response. So that's just a great thing to know how involved the community is in this high school and how important it is that community is known. For the same question, there were three other topics that were repeatedly mentioned, and that was diversity, education, and school spirit. And for diversity, someone said diversity, opportunity, and tradition. Just excellent responses. And education, a tradition of high quality in academics, the arts, and the athletics. And then school spirit, go Rams. And then describe your most impactful memory at the Highland School. And we got a bunch of great responses for this as well. And kind of the biggest response was friendship. And that's great. And how that overlaps with different categories like athletics and performing arts and tradition, like we also saw. Then describe what characteristic is most important for the rebuild. And we got safety, accessibility, and organization of the most common responses that we were seeing. Sustainability was a big one, and also design. Honor the history and look to the future. That was a great response that someone said. Honor the history and look to the future is definitely what we're trying to do with this feasibility study. And then for the teacher study, we facilitated a couple of workshops with the faculty and staff, and then we followed that with a survey about current spaces and desired needs for these teachers. And starting off with, it kind of got pretty specific to what that class was and what was in those spaces. But just to go a quick overview, what works well in your classroom? And everyone was really excited about natural light, the views that they have. You have such nice views to the east. And another comment that we saw was very little. There's not too much that works well with that specific teacher's classroom, and that's what we want to fix. What would you change to improve your room and space? Storage, outlets, space, sinks, lighting, windows, and flexibility. These are all big things. Ventilation for some of those kind of specific CTE programs, culinary, things like that.
You can see that we pulled just a little bit of how the data has come to us. So we've just been paring through all these hundreds of pages of surveys really to kind of find what those repeating sort of subjects are, if you will.
And then moving on to the student survey. We sent out a pretty extensive survey to the students, and we got really nice dispersed response from different grades, from different elementary schools, and then also what the kids are actually participating in. And having that, what are they participating in, is great, because if someone's talking about something specific, we can click on that respondent and kind of see if someone is in the theater program, we can see what those theater kids are lacking and what they need. So it's just a lot of really good information that we've been getting.
And we've been using all this data as we meet with that steering committee to kind of understand where the response is coming from. And we've been working with Jeremy about how can we try to increase the student surveys as we go forward. Because even though we've sort of now presented this information, we've left that survey open and we continue to watch it. So anybody that has students at home, and if they haven't taken that survey, make sure they click that QR code when they're in the hall or on the website and take the 10 or 15 minutes it takes to complete that survey.
And of the spaces in the school building that you use, how well do they work for the intended use? So we listed just about every space that the school has and let the kids rank them about how well they work to how poor they work. And kind of how the ranking goes is left to right, and you can see gym locker rooms kind of at the bottom of the list there. They're not working as well as they should. Followed by indoor athletics, and then at the top of the list is the library, where we are now. And the kids seem to really enjoy this. We've been here a couple times for a couple of meetings, so we want to give them something, a nice library, because the kids really enjoy that.
So we'll kind of jump through these real quickly. Just again, pulling that data out, asking, specific spaces, and did they think it was okay or good. This is all information that we can share and the district has, so we can just kind of jump through this for this presentation. Get an idea that a lot of responses were like, hey, we're kind of just okay, and some of the text that we got from that really helps to describe what they thought was positive about it, or maybe what needs to be worked on. The commons, I remember one comment was, we have a commons, like where's the student commons you talk about? So it's kind of interesting that we think it's been defined as a space, but yet maybe the students aren't feeling it the same way. So all this information that we pulled together has led us to some project goals, and we've just pulled a couple of these out and working with the steering committee, providing flexible learning spaces we found coming back time and time again, fully accessible campus, deliver a safe and secure campus. And as we start to look at the program that's being developed and how that works to the concepts, we're always looking back to these goals that were derived, if you will, from those surveys and making sure we're checking ourselves. So Richard's going to talk a little more about the program information and some design guidelines that we've been establishing.
Yeah, and as we talked last time, we want to go through and help the school district define these design guidelines and imperatives, and they have these different categories: flexible building design, flexibility in schedule, flexibility in the delivery of education, flexibility of socialization, flexibility of community. I mean, flexibility is the key to all of these. And then, of course, sustainability. So this is something that's ongoing, and we want to have this document with the feasibility study so that you have some guidelines. You know what's important to the district, so that as the designs go, you'll have those set. And again, just some examples. Daylighting, very important. The flexibility of learning spaces and some collaboration. Environments that have different teaching methods. This came up a lot with some of the teachers too. Can we get some furniture that isn't all just desks? Having a variety of spaces to sit, and not everybody likes to sit in a classroom the same way. Some people would rather sit high, some sit low, some might want to stand, so flexibility in those things. And of course, unique community needs. Something that's come up that's unique to this school, we found, is your Highland store, which is part of the Family Support Center, and making sure that that is available to the students so that they have access to that, those that have that need. I think that's a very important program we found. And then, of course, the school district's sustainability goals, meeting those. And then, so what's come out of these workshops and gathering this information? We've defined some program spaces, and this is really a list of most of the program spaces in the school. And each one of these, we've looked at the spaces, we're starting to identify, we have a pretty good idea of what the administration needs are, counselors, all of these spaces, defining the number of rooms within those spaces, the sizes of those rooms, and relationships to other departments and functions. So that's what comes next. We look at these adjacency diagrams so that we can remind ourselves and show what is important. This happens to be different ways of entering the public entry, the public square we call it. You know, it's important that you can access the auditorium, access the gym, and lock those off separately and have use, but there's different ways of doing that. You can do it within the school, or you can do it outside of the school where the auditorium and the athletics possibly have their own entrance, but secure. Looking, again, here's the administration, breaking down all the spaces that we've identified that they need and their relationship to each other. We've done that, again, with the counseling, careers, and advocates. And see, one thing we've found is these spaces exist in this building now, but they're spread out all over. They're not where they need to be to function well. So they work together, but yet now they have to be across the building because you're just finding space for them wherever you can. So defining where these adjacencies and defining the needs of the school and making those work well is the goal of this study and the concepts. Athletics, how it ties together, wants to be next to the fields, and performing arts. Again, getting dance maybe up to performing arts. Right now that's down in the basement. It's not a great place for it. So trying to get them all together where they can function well. Your art, you have some nice art space, but keeping those art spaces together and sharing some of the spaces that they need. And again, the family support services, that's a very important program that needs access to the outside.
I think one item here that starts to show up on these adjacency diagrams or things like this, where in the programming efforts we've had is, that needs some potential after-hour access. So it's not just buried deep into the school. It may have a sort of its own secure piece, if you will, and being accessed at different hours than a more traditional student. So then what we wanted to kind of really jump into tonight is just talk about the beginnings of how that program, those workshops and all that data that we've gathered starts to land onto this site. So here we are. This is just a quick diagram of the existing site. I think everyone in here is aware the existing athletic facilities that are kind of on that low piece, the home bleachers on the hill, the current sort of soccer field now, the existing high school, parking that's kind of at the northeast corner, and the driver's ed, and access to the back of the school there on the south. So as we as a group have kind of been looking at this, we established what we thought were 3 potential building zones or building opportunities. And we call it the west zone here, which potentially is where that current athletic facility is. And we said there's a zone maybe on the south, and you'll see that we overlap parts of the building. At this point, we're just trying to define how big does that program that we've developed, how would it fit on this site based on what we discovered. So we'll first start talking about some pros and cons. So the west zone, there's maybe a pro is little construction impact to the existing building, because you could potentially build a building there and students can occupy the current building without any issues. However, there's a lot of disruption to potentially major sporting fields, right? The football field, track, both baseball and softball. So we found this list of cons started to get quite a bit longer. For instance, you really have no access on 3 sides in that scheme because the city park and it kind of is landlocked in that sense. The topography, you're kind of much lower. There's some sewer issues that we've looked at the utilities. So some cons kind of started to pop out on the west zone. We didn't totally discredit it, but we said, let's start looking further at maybe the south zone. So again, here, this is kind of over the driver's ed and where that performing arts and that CTE wing is. There's the auditorium. Again, a couple of nice pros, potentially less impact on current parking because that parking that's to the north maybe could remain while this construction is happening. Potentially the playfields could stay in place, much like the west one, it kind of took over those fields. But the con is maybe that building, a building that's on the south here, is less connected to that sort of city fabric, if you will. Likely would force a north-facing entrance, and maybe the building block would potentially block the stadium. That was one thing that kind of jumped out as potential. So we actually took a scheme a little further on the south. And again, we know we overlap pieces of the building. At this point, it's just how big would that building, at the current program that we've determined, how would it fit on the site? So, performing arts might sit here, some classrooms, CTE, commons with a main entrance, gyms and athletics here. And again, we understand there may have to be some phasing to this, and we haven't focused so much on that at this level, but just how big that program would fit. So you can see kind of how big that building is in that sort of south scheme. Now looking at the north scheme, there were quite a few pros. Proximity to 21st South we think is a pro, not just for connectivity, but kind of creating that city edge. South-facing entry, we think if the building's here, you probably enter from the south, and that's a really advantageous thing. Potential for fewer phases because we think there's a little more area to actually build without having to phase construction from the, where a portion of the existing building might have to come down or build a piece before it comes down. A couple cons, though, is that's right where the majority of the student parking is. So that's something we need to look at. Also, does that limit the access to the site from 21st South? Currently, there's 2 drives, one right on the very far west and kind of one at the midpoint. Would a building there limit that to some degree? So just some things we pointed out. So we actually have 2 schemes. We have a north scheme A and a north scheme B, and here is A, really tucked right up to 21st, CTE, and kind of some delivery happens off that drive, which also keeps a drive down to the athletics, so that kind of stays in place and is maybe increased a bit. Main entrance with a south-facing, that public square we talked about, maybe there's an entrance to performing arts, or that public square maybe happens in the commons and is really having access to gyms and performing arts from that student commons potentially. Classrooms would be on the north in this scheme, and happens to be with an east-west kind of building orientation. You get better north-south lighting, a little easier to control from a sustainability standpoint. I say that because North Scheme B is very similar, but the classroom's kind of wrapped around the corner, and now they're a north-south building, and so they're probably more of an east-west windows. A little tougher to control, but not impossible. Just from a sustainability standpoint, a little more difficult. Similar south entrance, maybe a little less overall parking, potentially, because we have more building kind of stretching down the east. Maybe more phases, that's kind of our next step. But again, we just have started to kind of look at this size of this building and how it might start to fit on this. So anything to add, Richard?
No, other than we think it's important that with the existing topography of keeping these schemes to the north, keep that access that we have, that delivery access and that connectivity to the fields, keeps the fields in place, which you've spent a lot of money on those. Relocating them would just add to the cost, and it really doesn't, there doesn't seem to be any advantage to building down at that level. I would say that we do favor a south entrance, and there is more room on that north end. The width of the space available to build is much greater than if on the south. And the other thing we like is that keeping the taller buildings up towards 2100 South and out of the neighborhood and away from the park is a better solution, we think, more neighborly. And and really addresses that urban edge.
I was going to point out too that and there's some things where we've kind of split some athletics, and we think that maybe could work in both schemes. Those are some of the things we're studying, and a little bit the North scheme could kind of work either or in some combination. And maybe it's hard to see on the slideshow, but we actually have some numbers. Just gives you an idea of how tall. So this classroom might be like a 3-story building, if you will. Performing arts is kind of a 2-story space. And everything else, even though it says 1 story, might be kind of 1.5 stories, kind of a single volume that's tall. And then we've just defined in both schemes an amount of field that we think might replace what is there now, but there's a lot of discussion about how that might kind of shake out depending on which scheme goes forward. The next slide is just kind of maybe starting to look at what the next steps are for us is, and this happens to be, I think, scheme A of the North, just starting to mass it a little bit. We're not far enough to where we want to say this is ready to kind of look at every scheme, but just to give you an idea, this is kind of our next step. Take those building blocks programmatically and also now start to think about them from a volumetric standpoint. And in this scheme, we think, maybe there ends up being a courtyard like you have now that brings natural light into that. Let me just flip back that sort of start to see here. Maybe the lowest level classrooms of that wing, if you will, still get that nice south natural daylight through that courtyard potential. This is just a real early kind of beginnings to what the volume of that building might start to look like. That's everything we have really. We can flip back and we want to say thank you again. We have a QR code here if you want to snap it. Just any comments you have for tonight will kind of come to us through that survey. And if you have thoughts over the evening or towards the end of the week or whatever, let us know and we'll be able to kind of react to that as we move forward with the steering committee.
And if you have some questions, we prefer them written down so we have a record of them for the district, and then also so we can read them. This is being broadcast, so the people streaming will hear them.
Grab that.
Okay, this is stating, it was brought up in the SCC, which is the Student School Committee, or the school committee meeting, that a possibility in keeping in line with carbon footprint goals could mean shared teaching space, and the teachers might have their own teaching space, might not have their own teaching spaces. I realize everything is hypothetical, but I think before the vote that we all need to be aware of the variables that could happen if this goes through. How do we do this? Nothing's been decided, as we stated in the meeting. We're taking classroom counts right now as they're needed. I think that's something that the district would have to decide on, but as we lay it out, I think part of that is showing that the building works and can fit. I don't know, would you add anything?
Yeah, I just think currently our program is based on the information that we've done in those workshops. We haven't pared any of that down or changed things based on an educational delivery method. That's all still just being discussed. So at this point, what you see and what we've programmed is as if it was Highland being replaced.
Will there be an opportunity to have those facts before the vote? Is really my question about that, because that was something that I had for the, are we going to have all of those in our knowledge before the vote?
My understanding is yes, but
The question was, will you have the facts? Yes. I mean, we will have the final program will be published, and it'll show you everything that's in the building, and how many classrooms.
yeah, as a steering committee, we haven't defined exactly what that deliverable is to the board, but that's something that's coming up pretty quickly. Is what are those items going to be? And I think the program that we've developed with the steering committee will be a part of that, and I think that data will be in that program. We use a term utilization rate, and that's number of rooms that are being used at any given time, and a typical high school somewhere in 80%. So that'll show up in that program as we go forward. And so yeah, I think that's a great question.
Your second question was, old historic buildings are a staple in this community. I do not agree that modern sterile environments increase learning. i.e. Harvard, Yale, etc. I love the warm feeling in this school. It feels like a school, not a clinical setting, which I think modern environments tend to reflect. How can there be a balance if this goes forward? Okay, right now, of course, we need to point out that these are concepts right now. We are not designing the building. We're just trying to show the spaces that will be together and that it can fit on site. So if it does go through and the bond passes, then the design starts, and that's when things are defined as far as what the building is.
Yeah. And I imagine we'll have very similar meetings. They won't be in the same breath necessarily, but we'll have these same kind of meetings as we're talking about finishes and look at the building, if you will. And so, yeah, to echo what Richard said, we're just getting to the feasibility point. We need to be able to present to the board, this can happen for this many dollars in this much time, if you will. And we're just recommending, and it's really to the board to make that final decision. So. I think that's a really question for the board, or for the district, but my experience, there is always a little discussion there, yeah.
Next question, is this an all or nothing? Can we reconstruct things like HVAC, plumbing, parking, et cetera, while still keeping the overall original school intact? I think that the district's already kind of looked at those things, and that's why they've hired us to look at rebuilding the building. Certainly for some dollar amount you can, but I know that they find that there's building systems that it's just really hard to, almost impossible to replace in an existing building and get the teaching spaces and the adjacencies you need for in moving forward, with a new school. But I don't know, Paul, if you want to add to that at all. The other question is security. If this happens and security isn't the number one concept in the plans, I think it is a disservice. Last meeting, security seemed like an afterthought. What are the real plans regarding security? What exactly have you done in previous schools? What would you do differently?
I would say that in all of our steering committee meetings, we talk about security, and I failed to mention on our schedule, we have scheduled some tours with the steering committee to go see some other projects that we've been a part of and that we haven't been a part of, just to kind of get a feel for what's out there. Those are scheduled for next week at this point. But we do talk about that in the meetings, and it's something that we, again, this early as feasibility, aren't fine-tuning the exact, here's the exact secure entrance, but we're talking about that programmatically, that office needs to accommodate a secure entry that isn't accommodated right now at the current school. And a school we're building right now has that, so we're able to look at the plans that we did for that, show them to Jeremy, the faculty, the administration, and say, hey, this is what we're thinking, and we've done those same secure vestibules for the district and other locations and at different scale school, if you will, and just say, what's the difference between a high school versus, say, an elementary that we worked on? High schools are a little tricky because you have students that are moving all through the campus versus an elementary where the students are, say, once they're in, right? So that's a little different discussion, but it is definitely coming up in those steering committee meetings.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. We really need to remember that we need, different secure entrances at different times. It doesn't always have to be one secure entrance for everything all the time. For example, we have students that are leaving this campus every period to go to our CTE center or go to seminary. So we need to be able to provide secure entrances at multiple locations. If we're having something on site here, let's say we're having a performing arts musical or we're having a basketball game, Maybe we have a different secure entrance for those types of events that's different from the main entrance of the building. So those are absolutely conversations, and as the principal of this school, I will tell you is primary to my thinking is what can we do to make this building as secure and safe as possible for all people, all students, all adults, everyone that walks in. So that's paramount to what we're doing, with also building a great building that our students feel welcome and the community feels welcome in. So I want to make sure that that you understand that is very much being talked about right now.
And it's not just securing into the building, but it's once you're in the building, what parts of the building are accessible and what are not during, say, an evening event. Like tonight, right now, you could probably walk through most of the school. Can we set it up such that you can just allow access to certain limited areas? And that's a major part of the design. Again, that'll all happen once we're past the step we're in right now. But we want to make sure the step we're in right now, we're at least thinking about that, because it helps us to make sure this is a feasible thing, if that's in fact the way we move forward.
Here's a question. What is the advantage of a south entrance over a north entrance? In our climate here, when you have a north entrance, it tends to build up the ice and snow. A lot of times when we've had to do that for other schools, we've ended up having to put snow melt systems in the sidewalks out front, because they're constantly trying to keep the ice off and keep it safe to enter the school. So south facing is always better. You have the direct solar sun to melt the ice quicker in the snow, and it's just a better controllable orientation. Other questions? All right. How many students now and in the future? We're building this school. We've been asked to build a school that will hold 2,400 students. And I think, given the demographics, I think that's where the school believes it's going to stay pretty close to that number for a while. There is room within the building to go up higher than that. So it's not going to be a hard number that you can only have 2,400 students when we're finished, but it will. I think that's our goal.
Yeah, and really, right now, our numbers are right about 2,000. And then if you incorporate the School for Performing Arts students that are here taking classes, we're about 2,200 students in this building on a given day. So 2,400 is a good number. We don't want to be in a position where a lot of other schools or a lot of other districts have been, where they finish building a school and they immediately have to build portables. So we want to make sure we have space for everybody, but we want to make sure that we're not building it, too big that it's also being a waste in terms of the environmental friendliness of the building. So.
Okay, here's a question. Many California high schools are multiple building campuses. What are the safety and energy conservation implications of a campus with more individual buildings as opposed to fewer buildings?
I think there's some advantages from a mechanical and sustainable standpoint, because you might be able to run a single building on a mechanical unit that the rest of the campus could be shut down, for instance. Although kind of the opposite of that for sustainability is the more building envelope you have. So if you have the same square footage in 3 buildings or in 1, you end up having more total envelope per square foot. And that's where your biggest energy sort of downfall is, if you will, is that envelope. It's also the most expensive part of the building is that exterior skin of the building. So I think there's some advantages, because you can shut down a building. Maybe there's only one part of the building that needs to be run over the summer. But we have found that there's ways to do that even in a single building, and you zone it right. Maybe the administration suite is on a whole separate mechanical system, because it's a 12-month-a-year kind of space, where the classroom wings are on a system that's sort of shut down into the minimum during the summer months that are not used as much. Although in a high school, we all know those are almost entirely 12-month buildings, not totally, but what was the other part of that? Did I miss one?
And the security.
Yeah, and security is maybe the toughest thing is, again, we mentioned in high schools, kids are coming and going. They're going to other programs off-site. But as much as you can bring people into one location, there's a saying we've used, one way in, many ways out, from a security standpoint. As much as you can bring those students always in a front door, a secure vestibule, they check in before they go to their class, the better. And if you have 2 or 3 buildings on a campus, that's harder because they're always coming in and out. We do some work down in southern Utah. They have a climate more similar to California, and they do campuses, but they haven't had that same security issue in their mind. So we're accustomed to those. We can show some of those schemes, but they haven't been on this steering committee's radar to this point. So I hope that answers that.
And the climate.
Keep in mind, this is a really tight campus, so we have very limited space. So it's a really tight space. So we think it's going to be close to things out.
Anything else? Was there?
Are there questions out there we haven't answered or haven't seen? Well, we really appreciate you coming out. Thank you.
Yeah, just again, thank you, everyone. Please know you can scan the QR code, send in any questions that you might come up later. We're always happy to respond, through email or any other format. But really appreciate you coming out and getting some ideas about what's going on with Highland. Hope everyone has a great rest of your evening. Go Rams.
Who's going to be the easiest to contact them with the Westview News, done a story, and who's the easiest to